Okay. Just to ask really quickly, first of all, welcome to all. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. If the attendees who are with us presently, and we can see your names, if you can indicate in the chat whether or not you can hear me and you're seeing me and Rob appropriately, that would be fantastic. I just want to check in on that since we cannot hear you. Yes, all good. Can see and hear. Yes. Okay, that's fantastic and fabulous. Thank you very much for confirming that. And again, welcome. My name is Kate Benisek. I'm an assistant professor of teaching and instruction. I teach in the Department of Architecture and Environmental Design here at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture. And Professor Rob Kuper is joining us today as part of our 2020-21 lecture series. Thank you, Rob, for joining us for your talk, The Radical Reality of the Future, Comparing COVID-19 and the Climate Emergency Inside and Outside of Architecture and Environmental Design. Rob will introduce what he's going to be covering today, but I will say that this lecture will draw parallels between COVID-19 and the climate crisis, particularly regarding the individual and collective actions within and outside of the practice and study of architecture and environmental design that are needed to effectively address the climate crisis. Rob Kuper is my colleague. He's an associate professor in the Department of Architecture and Environmental Design here at Temple in the Tyler School of Art and Architecture. And Rob is a professional landscape architect. His research related to landscape preference and the attention restoration theory has been published in Environment and Behavior, Port Technology, Landscape Journal, Landscape and Urban Planning, and Urban Forestry and Urban Greening. Rob's work on green roofs has been published in Landscape Architecture, Landscape Architect and Specifier News, and Journal of Soil and Water Conservation. In Great Plains Quarterly, Rob proposed moving the Mountain Central Standard Time Zone boundary to coincide with the climatic boundary that defines the Great Plains. Rob hails from the Great Plains. More recently, he has published a study that estimated travel-related carbon dioxide emissions estimations from the American Society of Landscape Architects annual meetings and expos between 1960 and 2019. This was published in Landscape Journal and presented twice at the Pennsylvania-Delaware ASLA Chapter Conference in 2020. We welcome you, Rob. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Kate, for that long introduction. I appreciate you reading all of that.
Happy to.
I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time introducing this lecture because there's a lot that I want to cover in a very short amount of time. I anticipate having practiced this a few times, or parts of it a few times, that it should take about 40 to 45 minutes. And I have to keep in mind that I need to keep talking fast. I'll try and do a good job of slowing down if I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself. But the lecture's really broken up into three parts. The first part makes those comparisons or parallels between COVID-19 and the climate crisis. The second part is insufficient solutions to addressing the climate crisis that exist. And then the third part focuses on radical solutions as it relates to the title of this presentation. Much of what I'm going to cover today is from refereed or peer-reviewed research articles that have undergone scrutiny by experts before being published. And I'm just going to give you bits and pieces as they relate in this chronological or this order of the presentation. So let's get going. And I'm going to start with the title and trying to define the title. Those of you who have had me in class and know me, you know that I like definitions and I like words. The title is alliterative, but it also has a good deal of meaning. And I'm going to try and thread this meaning throughout the entire presentation, all three parts. So let's begin with the word radical. If you look it up in the dictionary, as I've done, it means fundamental, it means extreme, it means drastic, political, economic, or social reforms. But it also means great, marvelous, and wonderful. And indeed, I am a radical. at least I think of myself as a radical in some ways. And I know lately, in the last few years, this term has been looked down upon as, and instead of being something that's positive. But what's reality? That's also been a term that has been used a lot lately, and perhaps half of the country has one kind of reality and another half of the country has a different kind of reality. But it has to do with what's real, something that's a fact or an event taken as a whole, and something that's actual rather than imaginary, ideal, or fictitious. So the first similarity that I want to talk about between COVID-19 and the climate crisis is flattening the curve, which we heard a lot about, particularly at the beginning of last year when the cases for COVID-19 started to rise. So this is from the CDC, and you see this is a graph from last year when the pandemic started until a few days ago. And I'm really interested in these rising numbers of cases. And the first one on the far left is when you started to hear this term flattening the curve, because the number of cases was increasing very fast, rapidly, and the term that's often used is R naught, and it has to do with the transmission rate. And it may not have been logarithmic or exponential, but it was pretty high. It may be over 1 is a number that means that it's getting out of control. But we can look at the climate crisis, and in particular, the cumulative concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in much the same way. It has been rising. This is a graph of the Keeling curve from CO2 measurements in the atmosphere from Hawaii beginning in 1958, and which continue today. Right now, this is measured in parts per million, and right now we're sitting at around 420 parts per million. I believe last year was the first time that it hit that number 420. And this is as high as it's ever been. You go back 800,000 years, it's never been higher than it is today. So generally speaking, within that time period, it's never gotten above 280 parts per million. So this is a graph from Peter Kalmus's book. He's a climate scientist. Being the Change is the title of the book. And what this table shows, particularly in the left-hand column, the far one, is that as the percentage of the baseline 280 parts per million increases, it happens about every 30 years. And what happens is that it doubles. So this is an exponential growth in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, cumulative carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it will continue until we stop emitting. We humans stop emitting. Now I say that because we are the cause of this. We are the problem. Humans are causing global warming. And for those climate scientists who have published peer-reviewed literature, 90 to 100% of them believe that yes, humans are the cause of global warming. And that is equivalent to the scientific consensus on the fact that smoking causes cancer. I'll bring smoking up again a little bit later. So an article from 2013 by Stocker in Science shows that anthropogenic global warming, AGW, and you'll see that abbreviation later, it's irreversible on a time scale of 1,000 years. So if you've heard of the Project Drawdown by Paul Hawkins, I believe is his name, and the subtitle has to do with reversing global climatic change. It can't be reversed, at least within the next 1,000 years. So they lost me at the title when I saw that. It's misleading at best. But the positive news is once we stop emitting, if we can stop emitting, we'll have positive effects on anthropogenic global warming in the future. So if we stop now, the sooner we stop, the less severe the consequences will be in the future. And before I go further, there's one other thing I wanted to say in the introduction that I didn't. I'm going to be presenting a lot of information that some people might consider just depressing, down. You know, it's kind of a downer presentation. I do intend on ending on a somewhat positive note and thinking optimistically about things. But it's also important that we confront this information, because if we don't confront it, we're allowing it to happen. And we cannot allow it to happen. We've got to work together as individuals, groups, and all different facets of the organizations and bodies that we belong to work together to stop this. Another article, this is the Stocker from 2013 in Science, points out that if we were to limit global warming to 2 degrees C, it would require emission reductions of 3.2% per year. Now, this is back in 2013, now 8 years ago almost. And we're really limited. The economy is limited, and we can't sustain any reductions greater than 5%. It'll throw things off kilter. But Stocker also gives us some other deadlines, and we're only talking about emissions reductions. I'll hopefully make that clear why I'm focusing on emissions reductions in just a moment. But if we were to try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C, it's no longer available to us after the year of 2012 by reductions alone. The deadline for 2 degrees C by emissions reductions alone is 2027, and the deadline for 2.5 degrees C is 2040. Now, it may not seem like much, 0.5 degree centigrade here and there. This is the mean global surface temperature change. And 0.5 degree Celsius up or down could mean millions of people's lives. So it's essential that we get this as low as possible. So now, as it relates to COVID, about a year ago, there were some estimations that there would be a temporary reduction of about 8% in global carbon dioxide emissions. Temporary, because this was involuntary. There were all sorts of restrictions and mandates implemented, and that brought things to a halt. People didn't want to do it, but they had to do it in order to get grips on COVID-19. Now, this 8% figure is very similar to the figure that was presented in the 2019 United Nations Emissions Gap Report, when they stated, without any emissions reductions prior to 2010, if we wanted to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C, we had 7.6% reductions each year. Okay, so the temporary estimated reductions of 8% were just 1 year. And we think back over the last year, what has happened? Now, the Rhodium Group in January actually had some figures, because the year ended in December. They could actually go back and provide some figures as to how much of a drop there were. So in the United States, there was a 10.3% drop last year in emissions, which was greater. It's the largest drop since World War II. And it was greater than the 6.3% drop in the 2008 Great Recession. Again, this was temporary and it was involuntary. But what happened? We stopped traveling places by air and by car primarily. There was some reduction in production, manufacturing, and other things. But now we're starting to see when restrictions are lifted, people are starting to engage in those behaviors that they had to stop involuntarily before. And this is just 1 year. So you can imagine how much would have to change year over year over year to get us down to zero. Another thing I want to talk about is technological versus behavioral solutions. Now, we know, certainly now, a lot of us have already been vaccinated or are seeking to be vaccinated. And the vaccination, it's amazing what technology has been able to do. So I was reviewing some information earlier today, and in 40 hours, a scientist in China was able to map the genomic sequence of COVID-19. 40 hours. And it's been less than a year since, well, I guess, it was less than a year before these vaccines, in particular the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, were out and available to essential workers and healthcare professionals and so forth. It is remarkable. And now the technology existed, but in addition to the technology of trying to map the genomic sequence of the COVID-19 virus and get it into people's arms, there are other technological aspects that are required. They needed chemically inert glass, and the New Yorker had a great photographic portfolio on that months ago. Aircraft is needed to transport the vaccines from the laboratories to various distribution centers. And the same thing with trucks. But there's cold storage. Again, with the biotech Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, they need to be ultra cold, really, really cold, right? So you have to find ways to ship it and warehouse it. There's also a good deal of computer processing power that's needed for the blockchain chain technology. So all of these aspects, and there may be more that I'm not acknowledging here, require energy, they're technological advancements, or technology that already existed. There isn't new technology and research that needed to be undertaken over the last year in order to get vaccines into people's arms. But the positive is, even though there's energy that goes into this, there's emissions that result in this, we've got 2 vaccines that are saving lives and are over 90% efficacious, and 2 more that are over 70% efficacious. And then there's the scaling issue, right? As of a few days ago, at least 101, almost 102 million people have received 1 dose of the vaccine. 58 million or so have been fully vaccinated. 3 million people a day are getting vaccinated. That is astounding. And a little over 15 months or something since we are mapping the sequence of this virus until getting people vaccinated. But it relies on existing technology and research to scale it up. And we've all heard about the availability and the demand and the supply of these things. But that's something that's unique. But another aspect, that's all technological solutions, right? What have we relied upon up until now? Behavioral solutions. Now, when it comes to the climate crisis, this is 4 graphs of the various concentration pathways to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade from the Special Report on Global Warming from October of 2018. Now, what's unique about this, you see the gray, you see the brown segments, which is agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, and you see the yellow, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I want to highlight something here. All 4 of these pathways use carbon dioxide removal. That's significant. That means, going back to the article that I showed you from 2013 with Stocker, saying 2012 was our deadline to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade by emissions reductions alone. Now things get really kind of nasty and hairy. And there's a lot of question marks floating above. Because how do we do it? How do we suck carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. It essentially means you're growing plants, you're cutting them down, burning them, using the energy from burning it to do whatever we like to do all the time now, but you're also capturing the carbon dioxide and storing it deep underground. Okay, there's problems with that. As early as 2014, scientists began to realize there were problems. It may actually result in net positive emissions at 2100. 2100 is a benchmark. I'm going to refer to that numerous times. Also, there's going to be some competition for resources, in particular land. We need area equivalent to 2 Indias in order to use this method. There's other things that Fuss and others mentioned in this article, but there's another one that there's been 2 decades of research and development on bioenergy CCS, but only 1 large-scale demonstration plan existed in 2016. And here comes the big thing. There's a major assumption here that the technology is perfect when in fact it isn't. And it might be cheaper in the future when it can be scaled up, if it can be scaled up. And that might be cheaper than actually mitigating and reducing emissions today. So we're placing a big bet on something that may not even happen in the future, it may not work, so that we can continue doing all the things that we're doing nowadays. So there's other ideas. There's rock weathering. There's planting trees, which I'll talk more about later. There's growing algae and phytoplankton on the ocean. There's orbiting sunshades. These are really like off the wall, in my opinion. Spraying aerosol particles into the atmosphere. These are like desperate measures. So they're too energy intensive, expensive, ineffective, or risky, according to Hope Jaron, a climate scientist who wrote The Story of More, published it a year ago. What do people think about some of these methods? Well, there's been a study in Nature Climate Change. They looked at US residents and UK residents, and they gave them some information about carbon dioxide removal methods. And they found that once they learned that CDR is just kind of a risky move, they're unwilling to pay for it unless there's methods put in place, mandates, you might say, restrictions, you might say, to reduce the emissions. And they learned and understood their unwillingness to support this because it happens too slowly and it hasn't been developed fast enough and can't be scaled up enough. There's also a good deal of skepticism with direct air capture, DAC, and enhanced rock weathering because they seem like industrial processes. And people began to make the connection between industrial processes and the cause of climate change. Then you hear this term a lot nowadays, even in the IPCC special report on global warming of net zero, which you'll see again later. What is net zero? It means that we continue to emit, but hopefully and slowly decrease those emissions, while at the same time somehow creating negative emissions in the future. Negative emissions meaning you're sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So this, the 41 climate scientists in this online article, one of the really powerful statements is they tried to dispel 10 myths about climate change and carbon offsets in particular. That carbon dioxide removal tomorrow in the future can't compensate for emissions today. We need to act now and do drastic things, radical things to stop emissions. And it reminds me of something else. When I was a boy, I used to watch Popeye a lot. And there was a guy named Wimpy who always loved hamburgers. He was a glutton for hamburgers. Here he is. And he'd always say, I will always pay you Tuesday. I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. But of course, Wimpy never came around on Tuesday. So he never had to pay for the hamburgers that he ate. That's exactly what we're doing now. We're placing our bets on something that exists in the future that may or may not even work. So net zero, as Kevin Anderson, a climate scientist with the Tyndall Center in the UK, says, is not zero. And that's what we need, zero, absolute zero. So this article I read some time ago was published in 2019 by Richard Parnkit. It was powerful in a number of ways. So over the next few slides, I'm going to refer to it. But one of the most powerful as it relates to this idea of technological versus behavioral solutions. As he says this, technology cannot solve the behavioral tendency of humans to be xenophobic and selfish. Xenophobic being a fear of change or other people. This is not a technological problem. The climate crisis is not a technological problem. It is a people problem. It is a behavioral problem. So we need to address it with behavioral solutions. Now we have some experience with this over the last year. We've had to start and establish some new norms like wearing masks and reinforce them. You know, again, either verbally, yes, can you please put your mask up? Mask up when we go outside, seeing others wear masks, asking people to fix their mask, staying away from other people who may or may not have masks, if you're like me. We've also had to practice physical distancing or social distancing, as it initially was called with CDC, right? That's a behavioral thing. If you're walking down the street, we had to keep away from people when we're eating. You know, all of these things, these are new behaviors that we had to practice and reinforce. And even Temple University, everywhere you go, in Temple, outside of Temple, and other places in the country, these two behavioral things, as well as monitoring your own personal health and hand hygiene, these are all behavioral solutions. And they were enacted in order to keep COVID-19 transmission low until a technological vaccine could be established, right? But even then, even after getting vaccinated, people are encouraged to keep practicing these behavioral traits. So what we need is to establish some new norms. We need to stop doing things like this, traveling to London or other places on extraordinarily high emitting carbon intensive means of transportation, and start creating and reinforcing some new norms like these climate scientists, academics, and other members of the public who say, no, we need to stop, we need to do something different, we need to break from business as usual and status quo, and start addressing the climate crisis seriously and aggressively. Now, this is certainly going to be a downer to talk about human harm, but I'm going to continue some of the topics that Richard Parnkit brought up in his article. But first, focus on COVID-19 and disparity in who dies with COVID-19. This is a graph from the CDC, a bar graph. The colors have to do with age, but when you look at it a little bit more closely, you see that the Black and brown people in the United States are more likely to die than white people. And there's a number of reasons why. It may be that Black and brown people are more likely to be engaged in essential activities, you know, workplaces where they're working with the public and interacting with one another in small interior spaces. They may have less or different access to healthcare. They may put them at risk. They may not trust healthcare in the government. Because why would they? The United States has not essentially basically treated them well over the last couple of centuries. And there was another reason that is escaping me now. But white people, they're less likely to die in comparison to Black and brown people because they're more likely to be Zooming like I am now and working from home and not exposed to public and other people who might be transmitting and harboring this disease. So Parnkit outlines this 1,000-ton rule, which essentially says that for every 1,000 metric tons of carbon burned, one future person will be killed due to ecological catastrophes, due to extreme poverty, due to conflicts over resources. All of these are possibilities, and these occur over the next 2 centuries. So to give us some idea about what 1,000 tons of carbon is, it's every 4 typical long passenger jet flights. And if you factor in radiative forcing, so radiative forcing is the increased global warming potential of the emissions in the upper atmosphere. It's like directly injecting it into the atmosphere where it can do its wondrous thing and create the greenhouse effect. So what does long mean? I don't know. Long haul, it might be over 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers. But he also makes some suggestion that fossil fueled car and air travel advertising should be comprehensively banned in the future. Imagine that. Now here we're back to smoking. Now the FDA now has these Surgeon General's warnings on all advertising for cigarettes, and there are also some warnings on the packages and so forth. There's taxes that have been implemented in places too to discourage people and make them aware that smoking causes cancer. It's a fact. There's a scientific consensus, as I pointed out earlier, that smoking causes cancer. Now imagine this. I've modified this. This is an advertisement for a place in Honolulu, Hawaii. From the New Yorker. The New Yorker is, if you're familiar with it, a very progressive publication, and they're certainly supportive and aware of and acknowledge the climate crisis and seem to be supportive of measures to reduce the severity of the climate crisis. And yet they have advertising for places in Hawaii, encouraging people implicitly to travel from New York City to Honolulu. Imagine if there were warning labels to provide people with informed choices on the actions this advertising is encouraging people to do. So when I was offered a couple of dates to present this information, I selected this day because I happened to notice that coincided with Yom HaShoah, which is, in other words, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And this is relevant because Parnkit brings it up in his article. He states that, during the Holocaust, there were 6 million Jews and millions of others murdered in that rough time period of 1938 to 1945. He says the Holocaust was the greatest crime against humanity. But he also says that the climate crisis is the greatest tragedy that we might be participating in and contributing to and be complicit in. And he states, according to his estimate, 300 million to 3 billion people will die in the next 2 centuries, as I said before, for a variety of different reasons. So that works out to be 1.5 million to 15 million people per year. Now, it might happen slowly, and there may be a great descent, like a logarithmic or exponential increase in the number of people who perish because of anthropogenic global warming. This is severe. This reminds me of this video, a short video called Bill, where these 3 guys, they're white, straight men, sitting around at a bar, talking about the things, the places they've gone, the events they've participated in. Travel came up again and again, flying here or there, driving a fast car here and there, taking long road trips and so forth, right? And kind of jarring one another, elbowing one another, encouraging one another. So then the waitress comes around, and instead of providing a bill in terms of dollars and cents, or the German equivalent, she tells them how much everything they've been talking about resulted in carbon emissions, how much, the weight of carbon emissions. And then one of them says, "Who's picking up the bill?" And they turn and look over their shoulder, and it's a black guy and a brown guy. Now, is this true? Actually, there's peer-reviewed research that shows that yes, People who are primarily Black and brown in low-income countries in equatorial regions throughout the world have already been suffering, or there's a measurable effect, and that is that there's been a strong direct correlation. For every 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere, 59 cents of purchasing power parity is lost. Now, it doesn't sound like much, 59 cents, right? It may be more to these people who are working in, quote, low-income companies or countries, but there's 36 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emitted each year. That adds up pretty quickly. We also have this graph to help illustrate where this is occurring. So each bar is color-coded, as you see. The red bars have to do with low-income countries. The green bars are high-income countries. And each bar represents 1% loss of gross domestic product per trillion tons of carbon dioxide. Now, I think I failed to mention that. Why is this happening? This measure of 59 cents per metric ton is labor productivity loss due to heat exposure, right? Global warming, things are getting hotter. When it's getting hotter, you just can't work as long. You're working shorter days, so it reduces the amount of productivity that you are capable of doing. These are in agriculture, mining, quarrying, construction industries, and other parts of the world. So where's the USA? Right there at the bottom, right? And China's a little further up, but most of the countries, you notice, are red, so that indicates they're low income, and they're all along the equator. Unfair, it's inequitable, unequal, and this is what we're doing. We're contributing to this. Now I want to talk about credibility. So I'm sure you've heard and seen reports of Gavin Newsom. He got a lot of flack earlier because he was dining in a restaurant prior to implementing some COVID-19 restrictions. Even here in Philadelphia, Mayor Jim Kenney, same deal, drinking at a bar, and then he went and implemented some restrictions. Even Dr. Birx said at Thanksgiving, don't travel, don't gather with family. What'd she do? She traveled. She spent time with family. It reflects badly on these people, right? We can't take them and their words seriously. They're not walking the talk. They're not credible. Why should we do what they say if they're not doing it themselves? The ASLA, which is the American Society of Landscape Architects, has a code of environmental ethics. The ASLA says that it's been green since 1899. It's a play on words, which is kind of nice, right? It's nice and short, but is it true? So here they say in their first ethical standard, they want to support policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In their 2019 annual operating plan, they want to be a leader on green infrastructure, resilience, climate change, and sustainability. They want to be perceived as a leader. And they've also had these news announcements where they're fully engaged in addressing climate change and intend to reduce the organization's own carbon footprint. Repeatedly, they direct people to the We Are Still In declaration. They're a signatory. And in being a signatory, these are the things that they've committed to doing. These are the actions committed to reducing the climate impact of your transportation and reducing and understanding your greenhouse gas emissions. Well, my question is, where's the beef? Where's the evidence of this? I don't see it anywhere. It's certainly not on the website. And when I ask about it, no answers. So I took it upon myself, as Kate alluded to earlier in my introduction, to go back, find as much documentation as I could. I went to the 2011, 2013 to 2019 conferences, found the education featured speakers, and I estimated their carbon footprints for 2,821 speakers over 8 conferences. And then I used that and extrapolated those numbers to the conferences between 1960 and 2019. I got the attendees numbers from the ASLA's library and archives, and I used 2 web-based carbon footprint calculators to do this, and also related it to the labor productivity loss study that I showed you a moment ago, as well as the loss of September Arctic sea ice loss. So if anybody's interested in that, I can say more in the Q&A. So you get a total here. How many metric tons of CO2 are responsible for these 4-day events over 60 years? 4 days, each of 60 years. How much sea ice is lost in the September and labor productivity loss? I also happened to do some research about, conduct a literature review about carbon offsets. I wanted to know if carbon offsets were even worth it, because in 2019, when I began to question this and presented a preliminary study for publication in Landscape Architecture magazine, which they rejected, I wanted to know if carbon offsets were even a good idea. And I got to looking at them, and they're just not a good idea. Kevin Anderson at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change says they are worse than doing nothing, because they may contribute to a net positive increase in emissions in the future. So they all knew. I sent it all to the board of trustees, the president, and so forth. What happens? Well, their new method of dealing with registration attendees and exhibitors is to offer carbon offsets for their travel. Should we take the ASLA seriously? Are they a credible organization when they are trying to advocate for policies? If any of you are planners, I just was roaming around the American Planning Association's website, and I think they may be, this is speculative, they may be in a similar vein. Yes, they've canceled or transitioned from in-person to virtual conferences the last few years due to COVID-19, but they're planning a conference next year in San Diego, which is one of the most popular destinations for conferences and conventions, but it also results in the highest, based upon my own research, the highest carbon emissions, because the lack of train transportation that you might use to get there, and it requires a lot of people on the East Coast to travel overland or cross continent to get to San Diego. In addition to that, they have a list of all their conferences from 1909 to the present day. So they might have a similar carbon footprint to the landscape architects. I wasn't able to find anything about the AIA, in case you're curious. But I'm referring now to two articles by Atari, Krantz, and Weber, 2016, 2019. And they both found something similar. Credibility relates to personal actions. These both studies, over 2,000 participants. Basically what it says is, if you're advocating for a policy and you're trying to convince others to do something, your personal actions matter. So if you're saying, like I am now, don't fly, I can't fly. I have to mean it. I have to do what I say. So, and there's questions that the researchers asked that pertain to that, have to do with flying and other resource-intensive actions or behaviors, carbon offsets. The best thing is, if you're saying something, you're advocating for a certain policy, you have to follow that policy yourself. We're seeing that with COVID-19. Greta Thunberg, who we all know, caught a little flack some time ago. I saw this on LinkedIn. And because she had plastic containers for her vegan salad and her bread and her banana, banana is a tropical fruit and had to be probably flown in, while she's drinking out of her reusable water bottles on a train. Okay, so who knows what happened after this, whether she recycled all of this plastic, who knows, and composted the banana peel, we don't know. So the whole idea about this is, if you're not doing what you say, people can attack your character and your credibility. That's not good. So another reference coming up here. Where's the beef? She's not eating any meat. And she also has taken a sailboat across the Atlantic Ocean because she didn't want to incur the carbon emissions associated with traveling by boat, or more commonly by air. She's practicing what she preaches. She's still getting a lot of flack for various things from the climate deniers and people who want to sow doubt, but she's doing it. And I have to admit, some of the things I say in the classroom, this is from a student feedback forum, I think they're smoldering there is some potential character attacks. Yes, I've asked students to print paper, and I do print paper too. But I also can tell you that I've counted every single piece of paper that we use for the 2018 Master of Landscape Architecture accreditation visit, which is over 1,000 pieces of paper. And the result is 27 pounds of carbon dioxide emitted because of that paper. Now, what does 27 pounds look like? That's the equivalent of burning 1 gallon of gasoline. I could travel in my 2013 Prius C 50 miles with that gallon of gasoline, but in an airplane, you'll travel 400 feet. In the US, depending upon your source, there's 16.1 metric tons that each average US resident is responsible for each year. This is from the US government. Or if you believe Peter Kalmus, the climate scientist, it's about 20 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. John Nolt out of Tennessee is 23 metric tons of greenhouse gases, or including like methane and other things too, per person, per year. That's pretty high. Now, if we think about the future in 2030, which is one of the benchmarks in the IPCC's report, we've got to get down to 3.7 metric tons per person per year. That's quite a drop in 450 weeks. We better get started. 2050, what's our goal? Given that there's going to be 9 billion people living on this planet, 2.1 metric tons per person per year. That's just carbon dioxide. That's quite a drop. I'll show you a graph in a minute. But after we do some big things like stop flying, stop driving, then what do we do? This quote from Wendell Berry is from 1988, but it's relevant. To the extent that we consume in our present circumstances, we are guilty. And I know many people don't like to be made to feel guilty or shamed. But there's a great quote I'll show you in a little bit that I think is powerful. I feel guilty all the time. To the extent that we guilty consumers are conservationists, we are absurd. We are incredible, you might say. But what can we do? Must we go on writing letters to politicians and donating to conservation organizations until the majority of our fellow citizens agree with us? Or can we do something directly to solve our share of the problem? I don't think that the government and the conservation organizations alone will ever make us a conserving society. So why then is not my first duty to reduce as far as I can my own consumption? That's what we should all be doing. Think about COVID. We're all participating, right? We've heard we're all in this together. We've said it. We all have to wear masks. We all have to physical distance. We all have to self-monitor and practice good hand hygiene. That's as an individual, but collectively we could do this with these other semblances of our society. Here's a great graph from Wins and Nicholas showing in green high impact actions, blue and moderate and low impact actions. The United States government and other aspects of our culture have done a very successful job of shifting our focus away from things that actually have a high impact on reducing carbon emissions and instead focused on things like recycling, which is a moderate impact, right? So what do? We have fewer children, we go without cars, we stop flying, we buy green energy, and we eat plants. Those are high impact actions. Now I want you to think about credibility. There's a lot of people, some say starchitects, landscape starchitects, that have signed the new landscape declaration. What are they doing? Are they credible? Should they be advocating the policies of Ian McCard? Are they actually walking the talk? Ask them. Ask your instructors. Ask me in the Q&A. Ask other people, administrators, and ask yourself, what are you doing to stop this? So let's talk about personal responsibility, which is a term you hear out in like where I'm from in Nebraska. We don't want to issue mandates and restrictions on COVID-19. We want to leave it up to the personal responsibility of the individual. But we're also talking about sacrifice. Now, a few days ago, Lent ended with Easter. Lent is, I'm a little rusty with my Catholicism and Christianity, but it acknowledges the 40 days that Jesus spent in the desert, fasting and praying. It's an opportunity for Christians to empathize with Jesus by sacrificing something, giving up something, and practicing self-discipline. That's part of the culture. So it's a great way to try and build upon that, to give up things and practice self-discipline instead of practicing waste and want, which is what Americans generally do. Think about the American revolutionaries, how they and other service persons who sacrificed their lives for the freedoms that we take for granted and the privileges that we have in this country. And I read a great quote from The Color of Law from Richard Rothstein. And that is, I can't remember the quote exactly, but the sentiment is that, yes, we have these privileges that people who have come before us sacrificed their lives for, but we also have a responsibility to think about the future generations so that we don't leave them with an absolute mess. We have to make sacrifices ourselves. Now, World War II, the United States government issued a lot of propaganda. There was government was behind sacrifice of individuals, right? For the concerted war effort. So in some ways, you hear that come up again and again. I heard it come up with COVID-19. There's an article now in Wired magazine about the climate crisis as a war effort, particularly within the context of carbon capture and storage. But people living then were asked to just use less fuel, use less gas, use less hot water, grow your own food. Is your trip necessary? This is the government coordinating this effort. The government can do it again. The government, to some extent, has been doing it with COVID-19. We've experienced a good deal of loss over this last 15 months. Been unable to see or touch friends, loved ones, starting or maintaining relationships. We've had little access to entertainment, going to concerts, sports parties, etc. Many of us have had to work from home. If we're not considered essential workers, having to be in the workplace and interact with others and the public. There was a time, and maybe some people are still experiencing a lack of childcare. So trying to work from home with children around is really tough. And we've also had to monitor kids who had to go to virtual school. Some people have lost, a lot of people have lost their jobs. We've also, some of us more than others, there's been a period of mourning over the last 15 years. We've been isolated. Anxiety, we've experienced anxiety, depression, and of course, there's been a great deal of death, particularly due to COVID-19. We also have been mourning, even if none of the above have applied. Most of us have mourned the loss of normalcy, everything that we did before COVID. And I don't hear people anymore saying when the pandemic is over. I do hear people saying the new normal. Now think about that, the mourning, the loss of normalcy. Something will have to happen similar to that when it comes to the climate crisis. Something must happen because it's so embedded in our culture and our ways of life. It isn't just about flying and driving. It's about everything else we do, everything. So it makes me think of this Merle Haggard song. Are the good times really over for good? Are they? It's healthy to mourn, to express sorrow and grief. And we need to do that with the fossil fuel age because it's passing. It needs to pass. We've also had an opportunity, looking a little on the bright side, to appreciate certain things because of these changes in behaviors and actions and this disruption of what we call normalcy. We may have appreciated time with nuclear family members and appreciated nature and the outdoors, got more exercise, had less time commuting in our cars, and even had fewer instances of sickness, asthma, flu, colds. My kids both have asthma. They haven't had to take any of their asthmatic medication over the last 15 months. We've also appreciated science, the ability to predict what might be coming with COVID-19. And the scientists who are, Dr. Fauci is just like a hero to some people, or a tyrant to others. And we're even appreciating technology now, being able to gather around and present this information from my home to you all. Now we're moving out of the first major section of this. What am I doing on time? Whew. Now these two sections, next two sections are shorter. Insufficient solutions. What do I mean by insufficient? Yes, they can have a positive effect on sequestering carbon dioxide or reducing emissions, but not nearly enough to solve the problem altogether. Sustainable Sites Initiative says it's the most comprehensive system for creating sustainable and resilient land development projects. So I got to pick a bone with those words, sustainable and resilient. Sustainable for how long? Is it sustainable for 5,000 or 500 to 1,000 years? Because that's what we need. It's resilient to what degree? Resilience means to bend, to give way, but bounce back, right? But when I say what degree, I mean literally 2, 3, or 4 degrees C. Recall this article from 2011 that showed that the global temperatures of 3 or 4 degrees C are much more likely than 2 degrees C. And all models that are cited in this study showed that we would warm to 2 degrees C between 2045 and 2060, in the next 25 to 40 years. And all but 2 models would reach 4 degrees C before 2100. That is troubling. Things are going to get really bad if we hit 4 degrees C in 2100. Really bad. That's my youngest daughter's lifetime. Later, they point out something that's really important. Our responses to a 2 degrees C world, again, that's 25 to 40 years if we keep on doing what we've been doing, just won't work in a 4 degrees C world. So the things we're doing now, the infrastructure, the design projects, everything, that is for a world that's going to change and may not be relevant in 80 years, right? It's only for the next 25 to 40 years. So this idea of resilience, I think, is just not very accurate. And the same thing with sustainable. We're really designing transient projects. Transient meaning transition over a short period of time. Because we just don't know when emissions will stop. If we knew when emissions would stop and what the temperature would be, then we could design resilient projects. So there's the climate positive design challenge Pathfinder tool, which I support. I'm also critical of it, as you'll see. But the whole idea is that you substitute some materials with other materials that have a lower embodied carbon footprint, and you increase the amount of vegetation, in particular trees, which have a high potential to sequester carbon dioxide or avoid emissions related to buildings, right? So you see the numbers 608 metric tons and 702 sequestered. That it take 21 years to get to what some might call net zero. But if you can change that by substituting materials and vegetation, but there's still 201 metric tons emitted, which translates to 603 square meters of September Arctic sea ice loss, a labor productivity loss, and hundreds or thousands of trees to sequester or avoid an equivalent quantity of carbon dioxide. Green stormwater infrastructure. We talk a lot about that, right? But there's meta-analysis, over 28 studies of these things, these strategies on the left, over 30 or 40 years, shows that only rain gardens have a net negative carbon footprint per square meter. All the others have a positive carbon footprint. So we've got to change the materials that go into them. Now, this is just carbon sequestration. You know, these things have a lot of other potential benefits, just focused on carbon. You can't say that it has these things help us with the carbon footprint because it's misleading or inaccurate. Trees. There's a report in 2019 that received a lot of attention that showed we could cover the earth with trees. Yes, okay, that's the A condition. But once you start subtracting existing tree canopy, agricultural areas, urban areas, you drastically reduce it, and that's the C condition, at least in North America, you see. But the big caveat is if we continue with business as usual, we're actually going to have tree losses. That's what the red shows. So we got to stop emitting. Now, a few weeks ago, Leslie Sauer was talking about proforestation, which is a great idea. The idea is that you let the existing trees and forests grow and reach their full ecological and carbon sequestration potential. So if you stop deforestation and you allow these secondary forests to continue growing, you could sequester about 120 gigatons, that's 120 billion tons, over the next 84 years. That's great. But again, we emit 36 billion tons per year. So, you know, it does something. It's worth it. Again, has ecological value. There's a number of reasons why we can do this. Everybody should read this article, by the way. Now, radical solutions. Let's get radical. There have been, according to a story in the New York Times Sunday Review a few weeks ago, some radical political actions in response to COVID-19. Bans on utility shutoffs, tenant evictions, car-free streets, giving streets over to people so they can physically distance one another and get some fresh air and exercise instead of cars. Increased unemployment benefits, eliminating bail and medical co-pays for prisoners, released some prisoners. And finally, internet access for those individuals who did not have access to it before, so they could stay connected to others or connect to others. But what about the climate crisis? Wonderful article out of the United Kingdom. So this is primarily based out of the United Kingdom, what the UK would have to do to be absolute zero in 2050, not net zero, absolute zero. But it might be a good guide for what we do here in the United States too. So I'm going to show you two slides. One is outside of design, one is inside of design. Design being landscape architecture, planning architecture. So over the next 30 years, we're shooting to 2050. We've got to reduce the fleet of cars down to 60% of the current fleet, or reduce the weight of the cars to 60%. So they're lighter and they take less energy to move around. End air travel and close airports. Expand rail travel. End long distance shipping. You know, last few weeks we heard about the Ever Given, the Suez Canal, right? Did any of you see any of the photographs of all the ships that were blocked, the 300 ships that were blocked in that Suez Canal? Oh, it's remarkable what we ship. And fossil fuel extraction and use, that's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? And beef and lamb production and consumption. So there will be no more beef. No leather because we're not producing beef anymore. Reduce fertilizer use because of the amount of CO2 that's emitted during that process. And reduce paper production to 80% of the current use. And finally, our clothes are going to have to be more durable and require less washing, ironing, and drying. They can still be stylish though, but maybe we need some more classic styles and not be so trendy all the time. Inside of design in the next 30 years, stop all cement use. I'm going to go off on a tangent here. Okay, last June, there was this article published in Nature Climate Change, one of the premier peer-reviewed publications. It showed that global cement production was 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, okay? Which translates to 533 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emitted each year. It is, behind water, the second most consumed product on Earth. So, in the United States, you can buy a metric ton of hydraulic cement for $100. However, this article points out that climate and health damages of concrete in the US equal $110 per ton. So it's doing more harm than good. And yet it's everywhere. We rely on concrete for so many different things. But going back to that slide before, like imagine if we drove less, or if all airports closed and stopped flying. Some of these things are systemic, right? Airports require concrete for the runways, for the structures. So we would inherently reduce other things if we stop some of these behaviors and these actions. This article also pointed out and tried to investigate whether methods of mitigating the carbon dioxide emissions for concrete production are actually, possible. And they looked, you see, there's some 4 methods that are implementable now, and some, because they rely on carbon capture and storage, this technology that hasn't yet been scaled up and still needs development. It may not even work in the next 5 to 25 years. We just don't know if they'll work. So it's hard to place bets on something that may not even work. But then you see these 2 graphs here, the benefits of mitigation on the top and the health damage on the bottom. But when you're looking at the CCS methods of mitigating emissions, those that employ carbon capture and storage to continue concrete production in the future increase health damages. So we might be able to capture the carbon that we've emitted because we're producing cement, but it's going to make people sick. Respiratory syndromes in particular as an example. So besides stopping all cement use, we've got to reuse only recycled steel, which can be electrified. So a lot of this is going to be converted from fossil fuel-based things to electrification that relies on renewable energy. Reduce our output of primary aluminum, reduce brick output. Again, bricks can be made with electricity, but because everything should be switching to renewables, all the energy that we need now is going to switch into one sector, and it may increase the demand, but the supply won't be there. So generally, we're going to have to decrease, according to this article, 60% of our current energy needs or electricity needs. And the same thing, we'll have to reduce our glass output and stop using all plastic. There's a 1 metric ton of CO2 to 1 metric ton of plastic relationship. Now, You might be thinking, as some people have told me, none of this is real. None of this will happen. You're crazy. These are all pie in the sky ideas. Okay, fine. There's some assumptions in saying that. The assumption is that if realistic ideas assume that the present conditions will continue, they're based upon past precedent. Unrealistic ideas, which many people would say everything I've just said is unrealistic, assume that the proposed or likely conditions that differ from the present, especially those that are radically different, cannot or will not occur. It's a fact that Earth has already warmed 1 degree Celsius in the last 150 years, pre-industrial times, 1850 and 1900. And it'll probably warm to 2 degrees C in the next 25 to 40 years. It may warm to 4 degrees C in about 2100 that year. So we're talking about in about 100 years, the Earth may warm 3 degrees Celsius. That's concerning. That's never happened before in that short period of time. So the realistic conclusion is the future will not be like the present. It'll be radically different. Now, it could be radically different in a bad way because we continue with the business as usual, that's BAU, and the status quo and keep using fossil fuels, but we might also experience disruptive, frequent consequences. It won't be a sudden drop off like, like a plane crashes. It'll be a disruption, a long tail, some sense of normalcy. Does this language sound familiar? And then a new disruption, and a sense of normalcy, and a new disruption, a sense of normalcy. Or we could have a good future condition that's radical and disruptive, where we wean ourselves off fossil fuels, radically adapt, and switch to renewables with a significant decrease in demand. That's realistic, one of those. So getting near the end here, our response to the climate crisis must be honest. We need to look ourselves in the proverbial mirror and say, we are privileged, we are high emitters, and we are the problem. It's not somebody else, we are the problem. And we need to do something about it. If we don't, we're letting it happen. We're allowing it to happen. We need to be reflective. We need to make some changes and stop, think. Is this actually working? Is it having a high impact? If it is, we need to alter our approach. And we need to be resilient. And I don't mean it in the same sense that it's being used throughout landscape architecture and other professions. We need to expect obstacles and challenges and overcome them. We need to persevere. We need to be strong. And we need to be persistent. Nowadays, you're hearing about COVID fatigue. And yes, it's fatigue. It is tiresome, right? But we have to push through that. It's worth it. We have to be strong. We don't want to give up and quit. And our solutions, our actions, have to be varied. We cannot suffer and succumb to single action bias, where we think, oh, I'm recycling my bottles and my plastic, so I'm saving the world. No, we've got to do that. We've got to have fewer kids. We have to stop flying, stop driving, all the things that I mentioned on previous slides. We have to approach it from many, many, many different angles. Not only do it in your personal life, but be engaged in other organizations and groups that are working for larger purposes to convince the government, to put pressure on the government at all levels to act. So final 2 slides here. This one, if you've read White Fragility, which is a wonderful book, at the back of the book, there's a number of assumptions that pertain to racism and trying to be anti-racist and open to the fact that I'm a white guy, a straight white guy, am a racist. How do I overcome that? I think many of these assumptions can be directly applied to the climate crisis too. Being good or bad is not relevant. We are all, and why? Because we're all socialized into the system of fossil fuel use. It's in everything we do. So it's hard to escape it. It's hard to get out of it because it is embedded within our culture and our system. Here's the quote about guilt. If you're feeling guilty, the antidote to guilt is action. I was feeling guilty a couple of months ago about the amount of waste my family produced, food we threw away, and other things. We started composting. I feel a lot better now. And that's one of the very actions that I'm trying to take to reduce my own carbon footprint in my life and my family's life. It takes courage to break with the status quo. How can I support those do? Well, then this presentation is certainly an example of that. I think I've said some pretty unpopular things or difficult things for people to swallow, but I thank the Lectures and Exhibitions Committee and the Department of Architecture and Environmental Design to allow me to say this. And for those of my colleagues who support me and giving me the opportunity to say these things, that's one way of doing it. And finally, climate change may now and will soon hurt, even kill people of color 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's more important that we interrupt this and stop the climate crisis than my feelings, my ego, my self-image. So powerful. And finally, my last slide here. This is my positive spin on things. Thinking about the COVID, trying to bring things together. We have been adaptive. In a very short period of time, we transitioned, we pivoted from one way of life to another. It was hard, and we learned a lot when we did. And we have the ability to do this again with the climate crisis. We can do it. We've proven that we can do it. It's given ourselves confidence, but also it's probably instilled some confidence in businesses and their willingness to help, to engage in it and do something that is not so self-serving. It's given us confidence in our scientists, not only those who study infectious disease and who have predicted many of the things and provided these health guidelines to try and control COVID, and even government. Government gets a bad rap a lot of times, even from me. But government, in some cases, has worked with all these other people, scientists, businesses, and individuals, to solve this problem together. It's proven that it can work. And it's also given us some strength. It's certainly tested our mettle, our ability, our emotional and physical strength to overcome obstacles and in the face of adversity. Can we confront the climate crisis? I think we can. And COVID-19 has proven that we can do that if we work together in our individual lives and in other aspects of our culture and our society. We can overcome it. We can address it. And it's a good opportunity too. We have the knowledge that previous generations have had and did not act on. We can act. Imagine, I keep thinking of this book, The Greatest Generation, written by Tom Brokaw. He's saying the greatest generation was World War II. We could be the greatest generation if we actually tackled the climate crisis in the United States and did so we're not the second highest emitter in the world. We could do this. It would be such a wonderful thing to be proud of. And we've already made these temporary reductions in our lives involuntarily, but now we can continue them. Why stop? Why go back to what was normal? Let's continue these actions and try and implement additional actions to reduce our carbon footprint and keep moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for an extremely thoughtful narrative presentation. The structure of that was really, the message was something to behold, and we're going to unpack that a little bit presently. But the way that you organized that presentation is just something that I'm in awe of, and the evidence that you provide that has been your evidence for formulating your own conclusions and including that in your slides is also extremely helpful. So thank you for putting your citations front and center and allowing for people to learn more directly from the source. There's a lot to talk about. You're welcome. And we do have some questions that have been noted in the Q&A. And I would like to, I think the Q&A is great. I am happy to read these questions and verbalize them to Rob, but I'm also happy to kind of have people raise their hands and verbalize and vocalize their own questions and comments if you would like to do so. I encourage you to raise your hand. I should be able to see that in the participants window. So by all means, please do that. But first, I'm going to start with an anonymous attendee to get the ball rolling. Rob, what would you say is the first issue in need of addressing when it comes to resiliency?
What is the first issue? I don't know how to answer that question. I guess I'm being too critical of some of the words. Like, well, the first thing that comes to mind is we can't make anything resilient until we know what the end product is, the end temperature, right? If we stopped emissions immediately, or we knew that it would be a 2°C future and that would be stable, then we could design for a 2°C future. So, you know, the oceans are going to rise, right? If we knew that the Earth would warm 2°C, that would halt sea level rise to a certain extent. And we can design, we can move inland away from where the water is going to end up, where we can lift things up to a certain level. A lot of it stems upon knowing what the temperature is going to rise to. Could we do things temporarily, design things temporarily? Like I'm calling it transient design, yes. But if that's our goal, is to design something for the next 25 to 40 years, we need to try and minimize the embodied carbon as much as possible.
Thank you, Rob. We have a couple questions from Deirdre. Deirdre, if you would like to verbalize these questions yourself, please let me know by raising your hand. Keeping an eye out for that. I don't see a raised hand, so I am happy to verbalize them. One question is, how would tourism make enough money from local tourism? You know, acknowledging the fact that if we're going to stop flying at great distances, how do local economies potentially support themselves without people there to participate and inject money into those locations?
The New York Times last week, you know, New York Times, my wife and I get the Sunday New York Times every week. And when the pandemic started, they stopped the travel section and they started the at-home section, which I was so pleased to see. But recently they had a new section about travel, and it was all the effects, positive and negative, because of the pandemic on travel. Of course, the emissions went down, right? But yes, people suffered. People who relied on tourism for their livelihood, they were hurt in one way or another. So two things that come to mind. There was Hawaii. Hawaii relies a great deal upon tourism. And there were three ways of approaching it. And these aren't too surprising. Like, people organize themselves into three groups. One, people said that tourism is just an extractive industry and that ruined the place, the specialness of Hawaii. There was another group that we said that tourism is the best and it provides us so many resources, et cetera, and we need to do everything we can to get it back to the same level. And then there was a middle group that tried to compromise. It said, yes, tourism is an extractive industry. It really hurt our sense of place here and took away from the specialness of being a local. But these individuals in Hawaii, they started to adapt and find different ways of actually employing people who lost their jobs from tourism to engage in what they call green collar jobs on one or more of the islands. But then there was another example, and I can't remember, some tropical island somewhere, a woman who has gives horseback rides. And so this story was so interesting because, you know, the tourism stopped and they didn't have any more riders, but she still had to feed the horses, and they didn't have any hay that grew on the island. So they still had to ship the hay to the island, either by air or ship. So it's like, some things need to change. Some things this is an opportunity to reflect. What do we rely upon so much? And then that's a vulnerability. So what was the question? How would tourism make enough money? I don't know. I can't answer that question specifically. I haven't been studying tourism in particular. There's a whole body of literature on tourism, but it's going to change. People, yes, will lose their jobs. Some people will adapt and find new ways to make money and not rely so much on tourists.
Thank you, Rob. Ryan Byrne, I see that your hand is up, and I'm going to push a button that says allow to talk, so you can ask your question live. You should be able to do so now. Thanks, Ryan.
Great. Yeah, I think I'm talking.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah. Rob, I was thinking, and particularly throughout your talk, but more towards the end, there's a lot of emphasis on things that we need to lose. And, I think that's completely reasonable given the reality. But, we live in a democracy, and some of the social research shows that there are feedback loops. So I think ultimately to achieve buy-in, we need to increase the standard of living, broadly defined, socially, culturally, not just in terms of wealth, or maybe, even counter to wealth. But so I'm wondering, as designers, can we also, in our practice, use design to incentivize low carbon leisure and enjoyment, or create new forms of low carbon actions? So what is kind of the place of designers in that transformation that needs to happen, besides just like cutting our materials and moving around less and things like that? Like, how does our design actually start to incentivize broader change?
That's a big question, Ryan, but a very good one. Well, as landscape architects, architects design places that buildings and structures that people live and work in. So there's an essential ingredient to that. Landscape architects design outdoor spaces, whether it's in an urban environment, a plaza, you know all this. How do we incentivize? I'm getting off topic, Ryan. Can you repeat it again?
Sure, yeah. I'm specifically thinking about like buy-in in terms of losing things. And I think to lose things, we also need to give people maybe some opportunities or some new things that are low carbon. So thinking about, how can designers be involved, or what would our design look like to incentivize low carbon leisure, low carbon enjoyment, new forms of low carbon actions, to essentially replace those other things like flying, not as direct alternatives, but just to give our lives some perspective on our standard of living changing, yeah, maybe in a good way. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Well, you are. One thing that comes immediately to mind is trying to participate more in the preservation or creation of green spaces that don't require so many materials, particularly carbon intensive materials. Whether it's trails and forests, and which plays into the whole pro-forestation thing, or it could be other kinds of forests where people gain. A few years ago we had a flower show exhibit that was what did we call it? Like a food forest, where like growing pawpaws and other things where we could actually harvest aspects of the forest, but it's regenerative, so we're bringing people closer to the plants and the trees and the specialness, the special qualities of a place. And those could be pulling double duty in that they're sequestering carbon over a very long, slow period, but they're also allowing people to intimately connect to a place, a location on the earth. And I think a lot of that has been lost because of, for a variety of reasons. We spend so much time going places, either locally around where we live or far distance, and you mentioned air travel. So for me, at least, I know that's something that I've observed, is that people are, when they're forced to be local, they pay attention to what's around them. So as designers, we can either enhance existing spaces and help to preserve them and bring out those natural unique qualities, or we can create some new ones. I also thought about, what are some precedents that are low carbon landscapes? And I would have to investigate a little deeper and further to validate this, but like Central Park might be an example, a well-known example of a lower carbon landscape in comparison to many, like the High Line, who's in New York City, right? Or even there's this place nearby where I live. It's a Japanese garden from probably early 1900s or something. There's stone, there's gravel. There was once water there. huge trees and topographic change. And it was so moving the first time I saw it. So those are, I don't know if I did a good job answering your question, Ryan. But that's the answer I have now.
Thank you, Ryan, for your question. And thank you, Rob. There are two more questions that I do want to get to, maybe three, and they're wide ranging, and I think they're very important. One, I'm going to verbalize. It was communicated by our colleague, Professor Stephen Anderson. Much of the analysis here suggests that, quote, the bill is the responsibility of the consumer. Should I fly? Should I use plastic? Should I own a car? Where is my shirt made? How is the cotton grown and harvested? What are the production inputs to my phone? This narrative has, in what first seems odd, also been advanced by many of the industries that profit from goods related to these problems, because this deflects the perception of responsibility away from the corporations that introduce, normalize, and profit from these global cultural systems. Instead of blaming and shaming consumer choices, which cannot be perfectly informed, might it not be more productive to more aggressively regulate industries getting rich off irresponsible, dangerous, and predatory models? What happens if the bill were made to fall on neoliberal corporate profiteers? Note a recent study that found that the average US citizen will hear the phrase climate change less than 3 times per year.
Mm-hmm. I agree completely. And not too long ago, my wife pointed me in the direction of something that said that this whole idea of a carbon footprint, an individual's carbon footprint, is actually the idea of the oil industry, so that people focus on themselves instead of the oil companies. I agree. Yes, we've got to find a way to, is this question in the chat so that I can read some of the words?
It is. Yes, it is, Rob.
Okay, because there's a lot there. Instead of blaming and shaming consumer choices, which can be perfectly wrong. I agree that it would be more productive to aggressively regulate industries getting off of, yes, but how do you do it? It's extraordinarily complicated. It's this one book I read calls climate change a wicked problem. But how do you engage? How does an individual? See, I'm focused on things that I have the power to affect. And sure, I could become engaged in some sort of organization that places political pressure on the government or some regulating agency. And I should, but how do I do it? I don't know. I mean, there's so many different aspects of this that I don't even know how to begin to address, like the social aspects and the regulatory aspects. I don't know. I agree, yes, the bill should be made to fall on neoliberal corporate profiteers. Mm-hmm. How do we do that? But we've known about this problem for at least 33 years, 1988. The government has done an excellent job of trying to ignore it or deny it or sow doubt. And the government, as we know, has a good deal of power to enact some change and apply pressure, but they won't, and I don't see it happening anytime soon without some sort of concerted effort on a large scale. But I don't know how it's going to happen.
As an aside, perhaps, Rob, or maybe a question that I have, how do you feel about the American Jobs Plan that was recently announced, which calls for electrification and places for electric cars to help assist with that transition over many years, not soon enough, 10 years plus? Updates to our electric grid and also social infrastructure.
I don't know the details. Generally, I'm supportive of it, and that reminds me of, some of us watched this candidate talk on Monday, and which I found very impressive. And I asked one question, and it had to do with whether or not net zero was satisfactory. And we can't, I'm advocating for radical changes, but I think that'll turn people off. We can't do these things suddenly. The response that I got from my question was wonderful, in that you have to think about successes and reward successes so that it gives people confidence so that they can continue to remain engaged and work toward larger goals. So you know, what you're bringing up may not be the answer, but it is an answer, and it will provide us some, it's a transition point. And I think that could be powerful and effective. See, that's where I need help from other people, because I tend to be pretty black and white on things. And I need somebody who have people who have other ideas and cooler tempers than I do.
We are here for that in our community. Many of us are. I'm going to have 2 more questions, and I think that we'll wrap this up in relatively short order. We're approaching 5:30, but there's a lot to say, and this is very valuable conversation, so I don't want to cut anything off too soon. There's a specific question from H. Marsh. H. Marsh, would you like to address this yourself? I'm happy to read what you've entered into the Q&A. If I don't hear from you, I'm just going to do that. Oh, there, H. Marsh, I'm going to allow you to talk. Go right ahead.
Yeah, so I was curious, like, how do you balance, you know, caring about these things and wanting to do work that actually helps on like a massive architectural scale with the fact that you still need to get paid at the end of the day? Like, how do you network? Obviously, if I started talking about this stuff in like an interview, they'd be like, next. Or can you tell us about some like organizations or firms that you know of that like walk the talk, that, as you said?
Well, I see there's like 2 questions that you're bringing up. The first one, see, I see it as an opportunity. If you're starting to talk about this and bring it into the conversation, particularly if you're a student or someone entering the profession, you're going to have to deal with this in the future in some way or another, right? As opposed to the people who are now principals who will soon be retiring, and they won't have to actually address climate crisis in any meaningful way in the future. But the students we have now, and those people who are entering the profession, you do. If you start talking about this when you're in interviews and among your peers and to your instructors, people will have to start to listen, especially if there's a number of people who are doing this. But you also have an opportunity to position yourself as someone who's interested in caring in it and paying attention, knowledgeable, and who can lead in this and make some change, because you might be given the power to do it. Are there, what was the other part? Are there networks or organizations who are walking the talk? Well, I really can only, you know, okay, so 2 things. I was looking over the American Institute of Architects website the other day, and in preparation for this talk, and I was pleasantly pleased with some of the things that I read. Now, I didn't go into it in too great a detail, but they're acknowledging, one of the great things that I saw, that I read, is they're acknowledging that the lowest carbon building that exists out there is the one that already exists, that hasn't been designed, that isn't going through the design and construction process. So they're talking about adapting buildings for the current use or future use. That's a pretty bold statement coming from the AIA, I think. And there were, you know, they also have this 2030 challenge, which I think is good. They're addressing it. And I think they mean well. And I think they're doing the right thing. And they're not trying to sugarcoat things. And they're moving away from just operations to focusing on the materials and the embodied carbon. In landscape architecture, which I'm more familiar with, of course, the most immediate organization or firm that I can think of is CMG Landscape Architecture in California, San Francisco, who's responsible for coming up with climate positive design and the Pathfinder tool. You know, Pamela Conrad receives a lot of attention for this of late. I think she understands it, and they're trying to walk the talk while also trying to pay the bills, right? So they're trying to use the skills, the knowledge, and the materials of landscape architects as a way to sequester carbon, but also provide some of these benefits to the greater good, the public at large. So those are a couple of things that come immediately to mind.
Thank you both. There's a question from Fiona in the Q&A. Fiona, in my understanding, oh, Fiona, do you want to ask this yourself? I should ask you that question. If so, raise your hand, Fiona. And if not, I'll jump right into it. A measure to incentivize would be transit-oriented design in community planning, to incentivize a shift to, getting off of carbon. In community planning, and advocate for the transition to electric rails to guide communities away from cars. What are your thoughts on this, Rob? Maybe the feasibility of it, the prioritization of it, how landscape architecture comes into play with some of these planning and design questions.
I agree. It does make sense to try and incentivize TODs, transit-oriented developments or design, because they have the potential to, it seems to be one of the better ways of organizing the way we live in the future. And some places, particularly on the East Coast, are kind of already set up for that. I live in a TOD community, essentially along the Paoli-Thorndale line, and near Narberth, so I can walk everywhere. I could take the train into the city or out of the city if I needed to, and throughout the region. And other places that have mass transit are great places for that. In other places of the world, or in the country at least, they don't have that. I think they'll have a harder time converting or preparing and transitioning to a lower carbon future. And it's probably in those places that need to be, where incentives need to be greater for those sorts of conversions or developments.
Thank you, Rob. And we do have one more question from Deirdre. That's a clarification question. This is specific, how would aerosols mitigate carbon dioxide problems in the future? I thought they exacerbate them.
Well, from what I understand, you'd be putting these aerosols up into the atmosphere as a way of creating clouds and blocking out the sun. But water vapor is a greenhouse gas. Clouds keep heat in the atmosphere. So there may be some unintended consequences of this. That's what Hope Jaron brings it up in her book. They just don't know what would happen. But it's an absolute last resort. And they're just throwing all sorts of ideas out there to see whether or not they work. They're hypotheses. And there have actually been experiments where they're seeding clouds and making it rain in the past. I don't know a lot of details, but the general principle, as I understand it, is they're trying to make clouds and block out the sun so that it doesn't warm up the earth.
Yeah, I'm recalling a short list that I read in, I think it was Harper's Magazine in February. It was just short and sweet. It was all of the things people are proposing to do to battle and combat the climate crisis. And in no place was stop burning carbon listed in that short list. And the list included, science fiction sounding technological solutions that you have mentioned as part of this talk. And I thought that was a profound thing to think about. And you've given us a lot to think about this afternoon and this evening. Thank you very, very much for your time and your energy and the narrative and the evidence that you presented to us as part of your talk. I'm very thankful that this is recorded and this can be revisited. I'm going to record the questions that were offered by participants. And I know that within architecture and environmental design as a faculty group, we're going to be absolutely continuing this conversation soon in the coming weeks. And it's not a conversation that's going to end at any point for all of us in our academic community. Thank you to all who attended today for your time and your energy as well. And we look forward to having you back for future lectures and talks. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Kate.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop our recording.